All right, we are recording. I am Joshua Waits, the archivist of Virginia Theological Seminary. Today's date is April 20th, 2023 at 10:34 a.m. I am here with the Reverend Jacob Pierce, who has agreed to give his oral history today. Reverend Pierce, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start with some just basic biographical information. Can you tell us your full name? I just said Jacob, but so could you tell us your full name?
Yes, my name is Jacob Evan Pierce.
Thank you very much. Could you please tell me how you identify and any preferred pronouns that you may have?
Yep, I'm a cisgendered gay man, and my pronouns are he, him.
All right. Do you have a preferred name to be called?
Jacob.
Jacob. Now, Jacob, would you mind telling me when and where you were born?
Yeah, I was born in May of 1988 in a small town called North Wilkesboro, North Carolina, about halfway between Winston-Salem and Boone, in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains.
Another Appalachian boy, I see.
Yes.
I was born in the Appalachian Mountains of Georgia, so.
Okay, yeah. We're cousins then.
We are. You can take the boy out of the hills, but you can't take the hills out of the boy.
I know. I've tried.
I've just embraced it. There was for a long time I tried to lose my accent, and then as I moved out of Georgia, I went, you know what? Let's just embrace it. It's part of my history.
You should hear me talk to my mother on the phone.
It's the same for me. Yeah, my best friend is from Michigan, and she says, "You've been with your mother, haven't you?" So, where are you located now?
So I'm the rector at St. Peter's Episcopal Church in Charlotte, North Carolina.
Would you mind telling me some of your history before you came to VTS?
Yeah, so I grew up in this small town, and our life revolved around the church. I grew up Southern Baptist, and my father was chair of the deacon board, and my mother helped with the music program. My father was also Sunday school superintendent, and I had all those pins that showed I had perfect attendance. And church was like school for us. We did not miss unless we were sick, and that was the world I grew up in. And in sort of late middle school, I think I was in 8th grade, my grandmother sold the family farm in Surrey County and moved to Wilkesboro, just down the street from us. And she took me to St. Paul's Episcopal Church. And I was very inquisitive about other denominations as a kid. And even though the town I grew up in is overwhelmingly Baptist. I mean, it's about 60,000 people in the county, and there's something like 250 Baptist churches. And there's one Presbyterian church, one Episcopal church, a handful of Methodist churches, one Catholic church, you know. So I went for this Christmas Eve midnight service, and probably more as an excuse to stay up late as a kid, and was just completely blown away by what I saw. I had this both this curiosity and also a feeling that somehow I was home. I don't remember much about the sermon. I just remember being so moved by the liturgy and the symbolism. And so sort of slowly through high school, found my way transitioning into the Episcopal Church, mostly through choir. I sang in high school in a advanced choir, and I knew the music director, and she invited me to come sing for the Episcopal Church, so I did. And my parents were okay with it to some extent. ironically, as I was coming into the Episcopal Church, it was when Gene Robinson was elected Bishop of New Hampshire. And so there was lots of turmoil, at least on the national stage. And I had, even though I was post-pubescent, I had not sort of thought much about those issues. I hadn't really explored my sexuality very much. And then so I just kind of put blinders on and didn't think much about what the Episcopal Church was going through. And St. Paul's I knew was decidedly progressive on that issue, this church. And so I committed. And then in college, I went to UNC Charlotte, actually here in Charlotte, and started going to the Episcopal churches here, and was confirmed at my home parish when I was 19.
So you said your grandmother is who introduced you to the Episcopal Church. Was she an Episcopalian?
No, she actually never was confirmed in the Episcopal Church, but she had her second husband, who I had really known as my grandfather. He had died of a brain tumor, and he was not my grandfather biologically, but when he had died, she had been invited to a grief support group at an Episcopal church close to where she was living, which was Galloway Memorial in Elkin, North Carolina. And someone in the grief support group invited her to come to church, and she really liked it. And so she, for years, off and on, went to the Episcopal church, switched between Baptist and Episcopal, but she was always kind of the she's still with us, though she has Alzheimer's, but she was always kind of the curious progressive in the family, pushing the boundaries a little bit. Just an amazing woman. So
I call it Episcopalist, combined Baptist and Episcopal together.
Exactly.
There's just enough congregationalism in the Episcopal Church to keep a Baptist at ease.
Right. Exactly.
While shifting into a more liturgical tradition.
Exactly. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. Would you mind, you said that, in your sort of your teen years, at least early on, during the whole transition from the Baptist church to the Episcopal church during the period of Gene Robinson, you hadn't given much thought to sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
Would you mind telling us about coming into your identity and subsequently coming out?
Yeah. So I remember hearing at a very early age, actually from my mother, quoting what I believe is the NIV from Romans 1. Homosexuals will not inherit the kingdom of God. And that was sort of put in our Baptist church up there with what they would call unforgivable sins, as if there is such a thing. And blasphemy against the Holy Spirit, it's that's they put that in the same category. And so I was very familiar with that. And as a child, it's interesting looking back now, hindsight's 2020, but I was very sort of gender transgressing as a prepubescent boy. I like to carry a purse to church, and I've seen home videos of sort of my mannerisms and how I interacted with people. And they all seemed fine with that until I hit puberty. And it was really clear that, this is not what boys do. And I remember my father saying things like, men don't sit that way and men don't. So it's interesting. I do wonder today what I would be like had all those corrections not happened. I feel very comfortable in who I am and how I present now, but I do wonder about that. But so when I started going to the Episcopal Church, I was very in love with this denomination that I felt like I had discovered that was right under my nose in my hometown. And but was very troubled that there was this what I understood as a departure from Scripture. And so as a 13-year-old, I wrote a letter to, I wish I could find it, but I remember I wrote this letter to the Anglican Consultative Council, which was this conservative group of bishops. No, not the Anglican Consultative Council, the Anglican Communion Partners, which was a conservative group of bishops. And I thought that I think I thought I was writing to the Anglican Communion office or something. And I wrote this letter sort of expressing my dismay. And my mother was very proud of me for this. It's irony, so much irony in all of this. And so once I began to sort of understand my own sexuality, or not understand it, but know that I was attracted to the same sex, I really understood it as, in my mind, and this is the only language I have to describe it. So it's probably not the most couth way to put it, but I understood it as a fetish. Like, oh, there's this thing that I like, but it's not who I am. I understood sort of homosexuality as a life choice, a lifestyle. But just because I was attracted to men didn't mean I was gay. That's sort of how I compartmentalized it for myself, at least in my teenage years. And I went to college, and throughout college, didn't date anyone, never explored. In my senior year in college, all of my friends were coupling up and going to grad school or getting married. And I met this lovely young woman named Morgan, and we became very good friends. And we ended up dating. And I think in my mind, I thought, I just have to find the right woman. That's what has to happen here. I just have to find the right woman. And by that point, I was already in the discernment process for priesthood. And so I met Morgan, and we had a lovely 3-year relationship. And that last year, I moved to VTS in 2012. And it was really the experience at VTS that brought me out. I didn't know that I knew gay people growing up. I know I knew gay people. I didn't know that I knew gay people. We used to have this couple in my hometown. One was a Baptist organist, and I was always told he lived with his brother. And it wasn't until one of them died that I realized they weren't related. And we used to have dinner in their home. But VTS was the first time I met other gay people who were studying to be priests, and other gay priests, and people who were living their lives as faithful Christians and openly embracing their sexuality. And so I had this experience of, I think every first-year seminarian does this, maybe, but I was trying to commit to the full rhythm of VTS. And so every day, at least for those that first semester, I was trying to go to morning prayer every day and Eucharist every day. I wouldn't always make it to evening prayer, but I would do those every day. And I was a regular attender at the daily Eucharist in the chapel. And something happened in me. And what I mean by that is I was confronted with the hypocrisy in my life and feeling like I wasn't being authentic. And I remember having this moment where I thought, if I can't be an authentic person, then how am I going to be an authentic priest? And I had this terrifying fear, because suddenly Morgan and I had all this pressure from our family, like, all right, you've been together for a while. She wants to move to Alexandria. It's time to get engaged. And I thought, I'm going to ruin her life. I'm going to, because I know that I cannot keep living this for a long time. So I slowly began to come out. I came out first to a classmate who was already out. And then I came out to the spouse of a professor who was also gay. And those two people helped me slowly think through how I was going to first talk to Morgan and then later to my parents. And I did. I came out to Morgan in, over Thanksgiving break, my first year at VTS. And it devastated her. It did. And yet she showed so much courage, because her response was, when you tell your parents, I want to be there with you. Now, we ended up not following through with that. It didn't feel right by the time we got around to that. But it was clear that we had a deep love for one another that wasn't compatible, in a sexual or romantic way. We still are friends, that we don't talk as often as we used to. And she's active in her Episcopal parish and married and has a kid and is living a full life. But it was really the experience of being at VTS that helped me come out and be an authentic person.
So you were already in the discernment process. You're in this relationship, and you chose to come to VTS.
Mm-hmm.
Why VTS? Why not General or Southwest or Swanee?
Well, the three, I didn't want to live in Texas. I'll just say that. And growing up in the mountains of North Carolina, I really wanted to live in a big city, and I love DC. I mean, who doesn't? And so living close to the district was very attractive. And I really did want to go to General. I grew up in a parish that's sort of what they kind of call Mountain High Church, and General was very attractive to me. And my bishop said to me at the time, you can only go to General if you can show us how you'll pay for it without going into debt. And I couldn't do that. And so I'm grateful to him, because I was, 23, 24 years old when I was making these decisions, and thought, oh, what's $100,000, so I'm really grateful that he made me look at VTS. And so General just didn't have any financial aid to offer. They were already going through their own financial difficulties. So VTS was the perfect fit. And actually what sealed the deal for me was because I was so passionate about liturgy, I was really concerned, based on probably unfounded characterizations of VTS from years gone by, that I wouldn't get that kind of formation I was craving at VTS. And right before I had to make my decision, VTS announced that Jim Farwell was coming to VTS to teach liturgy, and he had been at General, and I knew of Dr. Farwell. So I thought, all right, that's enough for me. And it was the best decision, because VTS was not only the perfect fit for me, but I'm very proud to be an alum, and very proud of the seminary.
And now we have two liturgists on our faculty.
That's right.
And a liturgical music professor.
That's right. Yeah.
So once you came to VTS, could you describe you've somewhat described it, that first year of meeting openly gay people. But can you describe your involvement with the LGBT community here at VTS?
Yeah. When I was at VTS, and I could be wrong about this, I mean, may just be perception, but when I was at VTS, it felt like there were more gay faculty and staff members than there were students. It was a very straight student body. And there weren't any trans people on the campus at all, or non-binary. In my class, once I came out, there were 3 of us out of a class of, I don't know, 40 some MDivs, 40 some MDivs. So I understand that's changed a lot based on what I've heard, which is pretty remarkable. So it was a very scary thing. I didn't know how people would react. I didn't know how the seminary would react. I was concerned, based on just perception more than anything, not signals I had gotten but just concerned of how people might react to my coming out. I was afraid people would think that, I could hear the tape rolling in my head. Well, why didn't you deal with this before you started the discernment process? Or why are you doing it now? Or clearly you've got a lot going on in your personal life. Maybe you should take a break. I was afraid that I was going to get pushed kind of out. And I was very nervous to talk to my bishop. Who's great and one of my favorite people on this planet was Porter Taylor, who's the Bishop of Western North Carolina. But I had been warned that when Porter was elected a Bishop of Western North Carolina, which I think was 2002, that he had a reputation of being conservative on issues of sexuality. That's no longer true. That may have been true when he was elected, but that's definitely not true now. And so I knew I had to come out to him, and he made a visit every year to the seminary in the spring. And so the two of us went to lunch, and I came out to him, and I told him how afraid I was to come out to him. And I'd already accepted the possibility. I thought he's going to say to me, you should take a year off, you need to take a break. You weren't honest with the discernment committee, et cetera. And he didn't. Not only did he give me his unequivocal support, he cried with me. I mean, he was so moved, and I think a little bit hurt that I was afraid to tell him, but he was so moved by my honesty with him. And he wrote me this letter that I still have. I tried to find it this morning before this, and I couldn't find it. I know it's somewhere. But he wrote me a simple letter on his letterhead and a cardstock that he left in my mailbox at VTS that just said something to the effect of, "Thank you for being honest with me. I'm so proud to be your bishop, Porter." And that meant the world to me. So I realized a lot of the fear I had was really unfounded. I had a lot of support from the VTS community. And one professor had gotten wind, Lisa Kimball, had gotten wind that I had come out, and she invited me to meet with her one day for coffee. And we did, and she was just so great. She was so great. And the spouse and he wouldn't mind me telling this, who helped me navigate so much of this was David Hoover, who is Bill Roberts, Dr. Roberts' husband, now retired and living in Richmond. So those three, Lisa and David and Bill, were just really embraced me and took me under their wings, and helped me navigate this new, helps me navigate being open with my own identity. I didn't really jump straight into participation in the LGBTQ student group, but slowly started participating, particularly in my middler year. And then by my senior year, I became the leader of the group. I tried to remember what we were calling it then. We batted around different names, because this was a time when we were really struggling with adding more letters, and what does that look like? And do you just use the plus, or do you need to go IA plus? And so we'd actually at one time tried to rebrand it as Veritas, and just call it the Gender and Sexual Diversity Student Organization, and that just never happened, for a number of reasons. But what I was so surprised by is I remember we had this big cookout at, or maybe it was a potluck, but we had it at Bill and David's home my senior year. This would have been August or September of 2014. And we opened it to allies too. And it was bigger than the community barbecue. I mean, all of these people came out to this gathering, and I was just completely blown away by how passionate people were and how willing they were to show that they were allies. The thing that stuck with me the most that year was I was leader of that group when Westboro Baptist came to picket VTS, and I could talk more about that in a minute because I know that might be one of your questions, was sort of moments in VTS's history around that. But yeah, that was my involvement in the group, and it was a really, really great group. And I heard some stories from professors, who, some of whom had been there a long time and others who hadn't, that group initially used to meet for lunch in the private dining room that is now 1823 Cafe, and which was 1823 by the time I got there. But it had been a private dining room, and this group used to meet by invitation only in this private dining room. And it was by invitation only because there were students who attended that if their bishops knew they were out, they would be removed from the process. And this was not that long ago. I mean, this was 2010, 2011. I had colleagues in other classes, either just ahead of me and just behind me, who were out at the seminary but knew they could not come out to their bishop until their bishop retired, or they got a new bishop. They just had to be very careful. And so I felt very fortunate to have a bishop who was so supportive. But I think this is changing more and more across the church. Is becoming the exception is now bishops who aren't affirming. But it felt much more 50-50, even just 10 years ago.
Was the name you settled on PRISM? Because that's what the organization is called now.
No, we didn't. Yeah, we never settled on a name. We just left it with LGBTQ plus, I think, at the time.
Yeah, they somewhere in the past they rebranded to PRISM.
Oh, good.
They figured that covered all of the spectrums of the rainbow.
That's great. Very good.
So you mentioned, Lisa Kimball, Bill Roberts and his spouse. Were there, and then of course your own engagement in the LGBT plus organization. Were there any others, or would you like to speak more on what you have named, places of safety and inclusion at VTS while you were here, or areas where you thought there was exclusion?
Yeah. I would say most of the exclusion was outside of VTS. It was not within VTS. And I'll say more about that in a second. Certainly the others that I felt safe with and were open and new would be Ruth Anna Hook, who I haven't named yet. Ruth Anna and I never personally had a one-on-one conversation about my coming out, but I knew that she was there and I knew that she was safe, and that was certainly a balm to me. And I knew that there were lots of straight professors who were progressive on these issues. And there was a professor, I'm certain he's out, but there was a professor who's now retired, Dr. Tony Lewis, who did not come out until after he retired. And that struck me because he only retired in 2012. And I remember him telling me in a group of students in the Welcome Center. He just sort of said it, sort of nonchalant. I think we all assumed. And Tony is one of those spiritual giants that I look up to. I remember thinking to myself, he taught here for how long? So many years. And the changes he must have seen happen at VTS. There were also professors on faculty that, and may still be, that I knew were conservative on the issue, particularly around marriage, but they were always very kind. They never treated me any differently, or at least I never felt treated differently. I do remember once going to I believe it was an anti-racism course, but there was a panel one day talking about diversity at the seminary, and there was a retired professor who I won't name, but who recalled when Bishop Peter Lee, who had been chair of the board, announced while Martha Horn was dean, that the board had voted and they decided they would begin allowing partnered gay students to enroll at the seminary. I don't think that's the way they phrased it. I think they said non-celibate, whatever. This retired professor remarked that though he had remained in the Episcopal Church and he remained active at VTS, that he felt like the wind had been, or I forget how he put it, but he was very hurt. He was very disturbed that this had happened. And he just sort of made this remark in this room, and I thought, wow, the culture, the old sort of old Virginia, old VTS, it's still here, still in the water somewhere. So that was the only time I think on the campus that I can recall thinking, oh, the not everywhere is safe. There were more students, I think, than there were faculty or staff who were conservative. I hate to even use the word conservative, but just weren't supportive of LGBTQ people being ordained or being married. There were a few students that definitely fell in that category. But the exclusion that happened outside of ETS really didn't dawn on me until my senior year. And I remember, I think it was David Hooper, but someone said to me, when you begin to look for jobs, because my diocese had been very clear that it's a small diocese, there's not a lot of big churches, it's unlikely you'll come back to the diocese. So go ahead and interview for jobs wherever you want, and then you'll have a conversation with the bishop and you'll go from there. So I was interviewing everywhere. And David had told me and warned me that VTS can sometimes, for gay students, be a bit of a bubble, and that the church is not the seminary, and just to be aware of that. And I can think of at least, now I did a lot of interviews because I was eager to find a job. There were at least 3 interviews or 3 processes that I was eliminated from because of my sexuality. Some of them were more honest than others. Some said, straight off the bat, like, we're not hiring any LGBTQ clergy. Sometimes they blame it on their bishop and say, well, the bishop won't allow us to call, it's a conservative diocese. Others would say, well, if you were single and you just didn't talk about it, then this would be fine. But because you're partnered, it's more complicated, which just sort of still confuses me why that would be the case. And then others were a little bit more underhanded. They were afraid to say that they didn't want to hire a gay priest. But lesson learned, I got to the end of one process, had visited, been offered the job, and then when the bishop found out I was gay, I was removed from the process. And that was in a diocese where it was not well known that the bishop was conservative. I mean, on the national stage, he was all, but behind closed doors, he was not. And I remember a professor saying to me, just notice there's not a single open gay clergy person in that diocese. So that was an eye-opener. It was an eye-opener that the church was not VTS. And even once I did get ordained and got a job in Charlotte at a different parish where I was curate, it was clear that there were people in the pews that just weren't prepared. I'd been there for about a year, and the Orlando massacre happened, and I, for the first time and one of the only times, preached about my sexuality from the pulpit. And I got this really awful letter from a parishioner who came to church every Sunday, who suddenly realized that I was gay. And I thought, what? Did you come to my ordination? My partner was standing right there. But I don't know where he had been, but he wrote me this awful letter about he was so disturbed that I was working with youth, and he couldn't believe that I was being allowed to work with kids if I was homosexual. And so that was it was more of an eye-opener of that the church as a whole is just not as welcoming as the seminary, not as inclusive.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
You graduated with the class of 2015, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
So did you notice any changes either at VTS? I can't remember when the ruling would have came out June after you graduated, but
Right.
what was your impressions of changes either at VTS or in the in your diocese or in the church on the whole when the gay marriage ruling came down?
Yeah, I was very fortunate to go to a diocese where Michael Curry was bishop, and I knew exactly where he stood. And I had worked in this diocese as a layperson before I went to seminary briefly, and so I knew where Michael stood. I mean, Michael had authorized some same-sex blessings in this diocese, in like the year 2001. So I was not concerned about coming to this diocese. I felt very, very happy about it. What I noticed with VTS, or what surprised me, and I don't know why this surprised me, was how quickly after the ruling came down, and I should back up for a second, because a group of us students went to the Bergefell hearings in front of the Supreme Court, the rallies that were happening outside the Supreme Court, just to show our support and to be part of the group that was there. Jean was there, Bishop Robinson, along with lots of people from St. Thomas and other parishes. And so we just went out, and some of us wore cassocks. I was already a deacon at that time. I think I wore my collar just to show that there were loud voices in the church that were inclusive. So when the ruling came down, I was already in Charlotte by that point and had graduated. And the ruling came as General Convention was meeting. And they were already taking up canonical changes to change the canons of the church, which still defined marriages between one man and one woman. I was watching General Convention from afar and seeing the celebrations that were happening at General Convention over the ruling. And then those canons were changed. And so the Episcopal Church expanded its definition of marriage, which made me very happy. And what I was surprised by is that VTS so quickly announced they would also be allowing same-sex marriages in the chapel. And I expected more sort of like, well, we'll do what the Diocese of Virginia does, and we'll kind of wait and see, and let's take it case by case. But VTS was immediately, at least it seemed to me, and I didn't track this history closely. It felt to me like they moved quickly. And then my now husband and I were married in the chapel, the new chapel of VTS, by the Bishop of Delaware, who was my first boss when I was curate here in Charlotte. So it felt like it all came full circle. But that was the thing I noticed, that not only did VTS do what was right, but there didn't seem to be a struggle to do what was right. There didn't seem to be any sort of beating around the bush or negotiating. And they just did it.
Do you remember who was the first gay couple to be married in the chapel?
It was not us. There was a student. I forget. I believe he's out. He and his husband. Well, of course, but he and his husband I believe he was interim at a church on Bainbridge Island in Washington until just recently. But yeah, he was. I believe we were the second couple. from what we were told by the wedding coordinator. So
I'll just cross-reference the chapel register.
I
The wonderful
believe,
thing about the Episcopal Church is I know where to check for the weddings.
exactly. I believe it was Trippin or Rippin is his last name. I can't. We did not. We only overlapped briefly. He was a junior when I was a senior, so
Okay.
we weren't in the same class.
I've had some people I've talked to when they talk about the gay marriage ruling. One of the things that they noticed and that they thought was also how quickly VTS changed policies was that before Obergefell, if you were partnered, you could live in the on-campus housing. But after Obergefell, you had to be married, otherwise you had to be off campus. Did you notice that happen very quickly amongst people, or because some people have said that it was like instantaneously that the policy changed, that VTS went, well, when you couldn't be married, it was fine, but now you can be married, you have to abide by the same as everybody else.
Yeah, because I was already in Charlotte, I didn't know about that policy change. I'll be blunt and honest, and I think that's wrong. I think it's wrong-headed. I know that the same thing happened in the Diocese of Long Island. It was very public, where the bishop there said to all the gay clergy in the diocese that they had 9 months to get married or stop cohabitating after the ruling came down. I was told by a member of the diocesan staff here, former member of the diocesan staff here, that they had this conversation with Bishop Curry, and because he's so folksy. I love him. He said supposedly, I ain't gonna tell those boys they got to get married. So we had that same experience, Adam and I, my husband, where we had a lot of pressure from the church to get married. So my first job, they were initially going to put us in church housing, and but they said we had to be married. And we said, look, we're not ready to get married. There were a number of reasons. We weren't financially ready. I wanted my parents to come further along. I wanted my parents to be included in the wedding. Adam and I were clearly committed to one another, but we were not ready to get married. And it all happened so quickly. When we met, we didn't imagine that, within a year, basically, we were going to have an opportunity to get married. It was bizarre. So going back to give you another example, going back to how the church is not the seminary, I was invited to interview with the church. I visited. It was lovely. It was a great process. I really gave the rector a lot of kudos for how he ran that process. And I really liked the people there. Location wasn't ideal. I won't say where it was, but at the end of the interview, the rector said, I want you to come here, but you and Adam have to get married before you come. And that was before there was gay marriage, not only in the state where we were going, but also in Virginia. And I said, where would you like for us to get married? And he said, well, you can just go to DC. And my response to him at the time was, I appreciate that you think marriage should be open to us. I'm grateful that that's your stance. But you have to understand that when the church denies us marriage for 2,000 years and then tells us that we must get married on its terms, it feels a little bit like a backhanded slap in the face. So I wasn't on campus when that policy was made, but I think my take, probably if I'd been there, was maybe there should be a little bit more grace period.
But it seemed like the VTS was sort of just following trend around the Episcopal Church. At least from what I'm hearing what you say, because you ran into that in your own, except for Bishop Curry, individual rectors and dioceses were doing it. I think it's funny because you mentioned how Bishop Curry sort of very Southern way of responding to things.
Yeah.
I remember hearing him talk about uh, someone was asking him about divorce, um, you know, and about the fact that, to be remarried in the Episcopal Church, you have to have the bishop's approval. And what his stance on that, he went, well, I think at the third marriage, I might have a question or two. I'm like, so he's very, but
Yeah.
he has such a kind and pastoral way of
Mhm.
going about his ministry.
Mhm. Well, I think he recognized too in his response to gay marriage or same-sex marriage was that, it was hard in a lot of places of the church for a lot of people to understand why this change was happening. I think in other places in the church, it was like, well, duh, we've already been doing this, basically. Um, but in other places, a lot of teaching had to happen, and rectors had to really, and clergy had to really sort of walk their congregations along this path to help them understand why the church was expanding its understanding of marriage and who married and who who marriage is open to. The same is also true, I think, for same-sex people. We have a whole generation of gay folks who never imagined that that was a possibility for them. And while I'm not part of that generation, I will say when I came out, I thought, oh, I'll just never get married. It's just not going to happen. Not that it wouldn't be something that was open to me, but it just didn't seem. I wasn't sure where the church was going to land, and it just didn't seem like a real possibility. So it changed so quickly, and then in some places it did sting to hear the church say, "All right, this change has been made. Now go do it." Um, so it felt like such an about face.
Mhm. I think queer people, uh, for generations now, have had to own their own holiness without
Mm.
the church's approval. To
Amen.
then to have the church then say, well, for your relationships to be holy, you need to do it our way.
Exactly. I
Um,
think of the story of Louis Crew Clay and his husband, in the 1970s, before the new prayer book came out. Well, we still call it the new prayer book. Before the 79 prayer book came out, they talked about sitting at their kitchen table using the 28 prayer books marriage rite and exchanging vows to each other with the Holy Spirit as their witness. I mean, the kind of courage and foresight that he had, the two of them had. Um,
mhm.
so, yeah.
Um, so you said during the hearings for Obergefell, a group of students went to the demonstrations.
Hmm.
Of course, Supreme Court is very strict on who gets to actually witness the proceeding.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Um, was that led by the LGBTQ organization, or was that sort of an organic?
I think it was organic. Sort of the ringleader was my classmate Broderick Greer, and I think he was seminarian at St. Thomas, and he is also just a politico and was paying attention. And one morning he texted me to say um, so we went a couple times. The first time we went was for um, the hearings on the Defense of Marriage Act. And so we went for that, and that must have been the spring of 13, maybe. Um, and then we went again in, I believe it was either April or May. It must have been April or May. I can't remember. It was right before I graduated in 2014 when that was a Obergefell. Yeah, it was organic. It was not led by any student group. A group of us just went just to show our support and show that the church is not monolithic on this issue, and here's a denomination that loves you and God loves you. We didn't want the loudest voices there. We didn't want the only Christians there to be people who were in support of exclusion and, bigot. We didn't want just the only Christians there to be bigots. So
Sometimes you just have to say it as it is.
exactly.
Did any faculty join you, or was it just students?
I'm trying to remember. There may have been faculty that went on their own. I have a vague memory of David Hoover, who's not faculty, faculty by proxy. I have a vague memory of David being there. I think the Gay Men's Chorus of DC was singing, and he had a relationship with them or had sang with them. And I also have a vague memory of Lisa Kimball involved somehow, but I can't remember for certain. Yeah.
So you also mentioned that you were at GTS when Westboro Baptist Church came to protest. Would you mind telling me about that experience?
Yeah. I'm trying to remember how we found out. The administration found out first, but someone from Dean Markham's office, or it may have been Ian himself, reached out and said, I was the leader of the group at the time, and said, Westboro is coming to VTS. How would we would like your input on how the seminary is going to react. And so I went to a meeting that was a staff and faculty meeting. It was a particular committee. I'm not sure what the committee was. And it was mostly communications people there, administrative folks, and some faculty, and me. And we discussed how the seminary might respond. And then, and there were lots of ideas. One idea was, well, maybe we engage with them. Someone wanted to bake scones and say, scones, not stones, and hand out scones. There were all kinds of ideas of how or there was even an idea of, well, let's just ignore them. Let's just pretend like they're not here, because they can only come so far onto the campus. They were going to protest right in front of the sign at the corner of Seminary and Quaker. I went back to the group, to our student organization, and I think we must have done this by email. I don't remember us having a meeting. We just said, here are the ideas. We want feedback. And where we eventually landed, and I believe it was me, Broderick Greer, and Jeremy Froyen, who's now in the Diocese of Chicago, was that we were going to have a prayer service while they were here. And so we were in the new chapel at that point. This was after Easter 2, Easter 3 of 2015, I'm sorry. And we were getting ready to graduate. And we did a hymn sing with homilies from gay students. And so I think we had 3 or 4 of them, and we would sing some hymns, and then we would hear a reflection on one of the resurrection narratives. And so we read the different resurrection gospels for the Easter season, and each student who identified as a member of the LGBTQ community would after the gospels read, would offer a homily that was a reflection on the gospel, but then tied back to sexuality in some way or gender identity. And there was another group, this was not our group, but there was another group of students who the night before Westboro came decided to do a beating of the bounds around the seminary. So they did and I didn't participate because I had something else going on, but I was living in Maywood House, and I remember hearing them come by, and they sort of went around the campus and sort of beat the bounds, kind of smudged the holy hill, so to speak, protect it. But I was really proud of our response, that we did not engage, we did not respond with anger, we didn't counter protest. We did what Episcopalians do best. We gathered, we sang, we prayed, and I was proud of that response.
So was that prayer service um, completely student-led?
Was student-led, student organized. Broderick and I organized it. Yeah.
And I'm assuming faculty and staff attended.
Oh, they did. Yes, they attended. The only I think Tom Smith played the organ. I think that's right. But yes, it was well attended, and there were people from around the community who came. My now mother-in-law attended. She's a Roman Catholic, and she came. Yeah, it was a well attended liturgy.
Lovely. Um, are there specific events or traditions that you think the LGBT community at VTS have or need to, or that involves the LGBT community that need to be documented or need to be recognized?
Gosh, I don't know of any, and that's only because I think for, well, three reasons. It feels like it was 30 years ago at this point. It really wasn't, but it feels like it was a long time ago, and I don't really remember what all we did all year. The thing that stands out to me the most is we had a potluck every fall that had initially been closed. It had been you had to identify with this community to come to this potluck. And that was a reason for safety, for protecting students, right, who weren't ready to come out but needed a safe place. We eventually opened that potluck to allies, but then closed our other meetings. So we could have both, because allies said, we'd really love to come to the potluck and hang out with everybody. So so that was the thing that I remember the most. The other reason is when I was there, it is still surprising to me just how small the LGBTQ community was, or at least those who were comfortable being out. It was really small. There were 2 or 3 in each class. And there just weren't very many of us. And there were 2 or 3 in each class and 3 faculty members. So I'm not sure that I remember any traditions.
It's interesting how the class that I'm in, the rising middlers, or the rising seniors, I should say, because I'm part-time earning the MA, so I'll be graduating with the class of 24. But it's been referred to as the queer class because out of 42 students, 29 are queer.
That's amazing. It is amazing.
I think admissions we may have gone too far. We need to be a little bit more diverse in selection of gender identities and sexual identities. While you were, well, in the scope of your engagement with VTS, that includes before you came, while you were here as a student, now that you're a priest serving in the church, do you recall any pivotal points where there was a sort of a shift at VTS when it relates to LGBT issues, either positively or negatively?
I do not remember any pivotal moments that were negative. That felt like there was a shift in the culture or the institution in a negative way. There were sort of vestiges of the history, right, around this that were still lingering for sure, as in any institution. But I don't remember a shift in a negative way. The other thing is I was there really between 2 general conventions. So I started at VTS after same-sex blessings were approved, but before same-sex marriage. I graduated before same-sex marriage was approved. So it was sort of, I was at VTS in that space in which the church was really struggling with. I think we all thought we were headed towards marriage. I was skeptical. I did not think General Convention would approve it in 15. Um, and so we were all living in this space in which it was clear that seminaries are often, I think, sort of the sort of the labs for where people are having these conversations, right? And it was clear just from the conversations happening on campus that we were all struggling with, what does this church believe about marriage? I remember in a class, we were doing, I forget the class and what the project was actually, but we sort of got to self-select, and I chose to pull some 2008, I believe it was 2008, but some reports from the House of Bishops where they commissioned two different papers. One, what they called a traditionalist view of sexuality and marriage, and one that was the self-described as the progressive view. And thinking about, when thinking of marriage, how people prioritize the gifts of marriage. So is marriage primarily procreative, or is it unitive? And so those kinds of conversations were happening. The biggest shift I remember culturally at the institution was that potluck in 2014. Just seeing how many people I didn't even know were allies, who just showed up, who had never said anything negative or positive, but just showed up. And our gatherings and meetings have been so small until then. It just felt like, oh, there's a real shift happening culturally. That's the thing that stands out the most. But
I want to shift to some of your own work.
Yeah.
Because in our exchanges, you said that you are actually doing sort of research and work when it comes to LGBT issues in the church. So could you describe some of what you're working on?
Yeah, so I feel very blessed. I serve a parish in Charlotte. We're the downtown parish and the oldest church in Charlotte, the oldest Episcopal church in Charlotte. And it's a really funky place in a great way. I love it. We're about a little less than 1,000 members, about 980 members, and we're about 35 to 40% LGBTQ. Our 20s and 30s group is overwhelmingly like 90% LGBTQ. Longtime gay members. There's been gay members of this parish since the 70s, open and partnered and out. And this parish has been doing same-sex blessings since the probably the 90s, kind of secretly with a wink wink. There was actually a great interview with the former rector here, a former rector named David Pittman, who's a wonderful man. And he was asked if he was doing same-sex blessings in the early 2000s, and he said, well, of course not. That would be against church canons, but that doesn't mean that from time to time, we might invite a couple to come to the altar, and we might read some scripture and say some prayers and thanksgiving for their relationship. So, so this church has been a open and inclusive place for a long time. And we're also about 20% people of color. And what's happened a lot since COVID is we've had a lot of new trans members, which is great. So I feel very fortunate to be in a parish that is truly in every sense diverse. It's not as politically diverse as other parishes I've served. That's probably the one way it's not very diverse, but it's very very diverse in every other way, socioeconomically, gender, sexuality, race, and to be in the South, right? So it's so as part of that, I'm going on sabbatical actually beginning May 1st, and I applied for a grant for the Clergy Renewal Program through the Lilly Endowment, administered by Christian Theological Seminary in Indianapolis, and received that grant. And that grant, my work focuses on places in the United States that are central to the LGBTQ equality movement and the faith communities there that have always supported the movement and supported those communities. That was what the grant was written for. It's interesting because now I've begun to kind of hone down more because of my interest in liturgy and my focus in liturgy. And so I'm really interested in how queer people have shaped the liturgical life of the Episcopal Church. And that really grew out of learning things about these sort of liturgical giants in the history of the Episcopal Church, who I just am recently finding out so many of them were queer. So like Howard Galley, for example, who wrote Prayer C and the Prayer Book Offices and was a well-known layperson and liturgist, and how he lived his own life in the West Village in the 1970s and 80s, and the people who knew him and what I've learned about him. And so that's sort of where my focus has shifted. It's interesting, though, as I think about not only these queer people who have shaped the liturgical life of the Episcopal Church and the liturgies of the Episcopal Church, so much of that history was either unintentionally or intentionally lost or hidden. And I think probably both is true. I think without getting into too many details here, because I'm thinking about writing a D-Min on this, if I were to go into most Episcopal congregations and say, so the guy who wrote Prayer C, let me tell you a lot about who he was and how he lived his life, it would shock most people, right? It'd make them very uncomfortable. What I am now thinking about and sort of the future of the Episcopal Church, and you mentioned the class at VTS known as the queer class, is how can the seminary prepare congregations for queer leadership and queer clergy? Because it's clear that the Holy Spirit in this church has always and is now calling queer people to ordained ministry and to lay leadership, right? And so how can the seminary prepare congregations and prepare the church to not only welcome, but be embraced by these queer clergy? I worry. Maybe I'm a pessimist. I hope I'm not. Maybe I'm just thinking about my own experience 8 years ago. But I worry about particularly trans and non-binary clergy who are looking for jobs when they're graduating. And so I think the seminary has a responsibility in that way to prepare congregations for that.
Well, that sort of leads into the next question that I have, which is, you talk about how the seminary, and we can make that broader. We could say seminaries, but particularly VTS, right, would prepare congregations in the church at large to receive queer ministers, both ordained and lay. Mm-hmm. What do you imagine? What future do you hope for with VTS? That being one element when it comes to LGBT individuals.
Can you say more?
So, yeah. What do you imagine? How do you think VTS will grow in its relationship, advocacy, or work with the LGBT community?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think VTS is in such a unique place because of its size, its financial help, its leadership with Dean Markham, and the administration and faculty and staff. I think VTS is in a unique place to do a lot for the church, as it already is. And I suspect that the cultural struggles within the church almost always mirror the cultural struggles in in the larger culture. I suspect that a lot has changed in a lot of Episcopal churches when it comes to two cisgendered men getting married. It feels that feels controversial. Okay, 2000, 10 years ago, right? Every Episcopal church in Charlotte now is doing same-sex marriages, or at least on paper say they do. That wasn't true just 8 years ago, or even less than that. And so I worry, though, about non-binary and trans clergy and seminarians, and because of the anti-trans and transphobic cultural moment that we're living in. I think a lot about the trans folks in the pews of my own congregation, one of whom is discerning currently. And so not only do I hope VTS will be a safe place, I wonder what VTS could do for the wider church to not only support those who are non-binary and trans in their discernment, but in preparing to serve the church. I know that's very broad. I don't have specifics.
Yeah.
If I did, I'd send them to Ian.
There you go.
No, I'm kidding. Yeah. But yeah.
I think about someone during the last general convention. I was keeping track, and someone noticed among the delegates, there were no trans women present. And I think there was only like one trans man, and anyone else that would represent the trans community were people that would identify as non-binary. And they were going, so there's also this mirroring within the church of sort of erasure of trans women that's taking place in the broader culture as well. I see where you're, and I think also you said, given your unique position as far as where you are rector, how does that, trying to figure out how I want to word the question, is your research and work that you're doing now, how much of that is a reflection of your pastoral ministry of where you are versus your own sort of lived experience?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. It's one I'm still struggling to answer, and I ask myself that question a lot. I think it initially started as my own about my own personal understanding of myself and how that connected to my vocation as a priest, unrelated to my work as rector. And I'm parsing those two things, right? So my job is I'm the rector of St. Peter's, but I'm vocationally a priest. And there's lots of overlap, but that's not really your question. Your question was, I think at some point during the pandemic, maybe it was COVID, there were moments where, for various reasons, I was feeling like, and I have felt for a long time, but I think it finally came to the fore for me. Maybe I just had too much time for introspection, but I was feeling like my vocation and my understanding of my own identity were at conflict. That I suddenly felt like, how do I be my fully authentic self as a gay person, a gay man, and still be a priest? So, for example, I had a parishioner at church who's a gay man and started painting his nails, and I thought, I really like that. And I noticed that he came to communion, and I said something to him after church, said that your nails look great. And he said, you should try it. And I said, I'd love to, but I don't think I could do that. Like, I don't think, can you imagine like me giving people communion with, and I thought, wait, why do I feel that way? Like, I can't just be me. I mean, now as a liturgist, and I say liturgist generously, I'm not like, a liturgical theologian by any stretch, but as someone who's passionate about liturgy, there's something to be said about like when you're in liturgy and you're vested, you're about sort of, it's not about you as an individual, right? It's about the community. But just feeling like I couldn't, again, maybe it's that little boy in me, I couldn't present in ways I wanted to present. So some of this work initially started, yes, out of my own sense of like, I want to claim this identity and both study and reflect on how my identity as a gay man is deeply connected to my vocation as a priest. It has since grown it has since grown beyond that to think more broadly about gender expression and gender identity. And that really is a reflection of my work here as rector. And seeing, so for example, in Monday at Holy Week, I'm blessed with a lot of retired clergy at St. Peter's. We have like 7 who are affiliated with the church, which is great, but there's only 2 full-time priests. And so all the clergy, we wrote a letter in support for our trans rights, basically. And so we wrote this letter as we were going into Holy Week and preparing to renew our baptismal promises. And I got lots of positive feedback, but at the Easter Vigil, a newish trans member to the community came up to me and with tears streaming down their face said to me, this was the first time I have ever felt like I was a part of a faith community where I felt like I could trust the clergy. And that meant the world to me because I want them to feel like they can trust. And I understand that feeling, not in the same way, but I've been a part of churches where I knew I was welcome as a gay person, but didn't know how much I could really trust them. So it's become both. It's become connected to me as an individual, but also my work in this really unique context, serving a faith community that has a lot of queer people in it and is located in the urban South. So,
is there anything else you would like to share with your experience with the LGBT community and its history with VTS?
No, just to say that I'm really proud of VTS. It's amazing how far VTS has come. And I didn't come this October, but came to Convocation the October before. And there's so many reasons to be proud of VTS. I'm so proud of the reparation work, so proud of the bicentennial campaign. I'm proud of how VTS has moved in terms of support of the LGBTQ plus community. I feel a little bit of jealousy that maybe I went to seminary a little too early. Like I want to go back a little bit, but yeah, I think that's probably the only other thing I feel like I need to say. Yeah.
Well, there's always the D-Min program.
That's true. That's true.
Well, Jacob, thank you very much for agreeing to give your story. We are honored to have it as part of the Called and Holy LGBTQ Oral History Project. And we thank you so much for your work that you have done and will continue to do for the church on this issue.
Right. Thank you, Joshua.